across America. Live. This is Point of View. And now, Kerby Anderson.
Thank you for joining me. It is the Thursday edition of Point of View. In the first hour, we're going to be talking about, as I announced yesterday, with Tim Goeglein as we get into his new book, What Really Matters. So we're going to be talking about faith, freedom, and family. Second hour, we're going to get into what the church can do to save faith and family in America. And then we'll get back to some of the issues in the news, not the least of which is a very good piece that I've posted for you to read on what is happening right now in Iran, especially in the economy, as well as a couple of other issues that we'll try to cover before we run out of time in these 2 hours. If we don't get to all of that, of course, Friday's our weekend edition, and I might just mention the Supreme Court has come down with a couple of very significant cases, but since we have Kelly Shackelford with First Liberty Institute with us tomorrow, as part of the roundtable, we will get into those. So I'm mindful of some very significant court cases that have come down, but we'll wait till tomorrow to get into some of those. Tim Goeglein should be no stranger to you. Penna Dexter has done interviews with him in the past. I was even looking over some of the times in which I have quoted his columns in some of the commentaries I've done. He serves as the Vice President for External and Government Relations at Focus on the Family there in Washington, D.C. As I mentioned yesterday, of course, he has served as the Special Assistant to President George W. Bush, where he was the Deputy Director of the White House Office of Public Liaison. As an individual, also has served as Senior Fellow at the Heritage Foundation, a Professor of Government at Liberty University. Dr. Tim Goeglein, welcome back to Point of View.
Thank you, Kerby. It is always a great joy to be a part of this program.
Well, let's, if we can, maybe explain the book a little bit, What Really Matters. In some respects, it reminded me of an interview I did years ago with Bill Bennett. He wrote this book called What Works. And in some respects, he was explaining what works in terms of education. Your various columns, many of which I've read and some of which I've even quoted on my own commentaries, really, in a sense, tell us what works. If we want to have human flourishing, if we want marriages to flourish, if we want families to flourish, in some respects, these columns that you have in there are a reminder of what we have learned through not only biblical instruction, but even through the test of history of what works and what makes for a good and flourishing society.
You know, it absolutely does. And I'll tell you, to take one step sideways, Kerby, 2 years ago, I wrote a book called Stumbling Toward Utopia.
Yeah, I remember that.
Which, yes, you may recall, was a deep dive investigation into what caused the moral and social revolution of the 1960s and 70s. And by God's grace, the book got a lot of attention. And I was rereading that book, about 2 years ago. And I said to myself, for all the good, by God's grace, that Stumbling Toward Utopia, did, I felt that I did not adequately demonstrate the direct impact of the moral and social revolution on the most important institutions of the 21st century. And as one of the vice presidents at Focus on the Family, I travel all the time. And I was speaking at a very well-known university just a couple of years ago, and a young woman who at the time was a junior, after my speech, after the Q&A, there's always a few students who stay around to continue the conversation. And she said to me, Mr. Goeglein, I think I agree, with most of what you shared today. But she said to me, why does the political class never seem to discuss what really matters? And I thought to myself, that's the theme, and that's the book, which is what really matters is family, marriage, parenting, human life, religious liberty, conscience rights, parental rights, pronouns with objective meanings. Why does the political class shy away from, and this is our 250th birthday year in America, why do they shy away from speaking about defending, nourishing the institutions that matter most? So that is my motivation in writing the book. And what really matters, in my view, should be on the tip of the tongue of everybody who's listening, because if we're going to have another 250 years, and I'm an inveterate optimist, I believe we will, we have got to restore, renew, regenerate the American family. It's an absolute must.
Let me just mention, too, since you did mention stumbling towards utopia, also towards a more perfect union, American restoration. I understand you even have one coming out later on Pay It Forward. So we're in the midst of a series of books that you have done. But let's, if we can, one of the early parts of your book talks about cohabitation, and I'll hold up our booklet here. One of the things, Tim, we do is each month I produce a booklet, or one of our staff does, and we did this one on cohabitation a while back because we were finding not only are individuals who are not Christians living together, more and more Christians are living together, and they say, well, I know maybe the Bible speaks against it, but are there other reasons to be concerned about what that might mean? And you spend some time talking about the fact that early on, cohabitation is a false hope, and it actually is increasing your likelihood of a future divorce.
It absolutely is. And by the way, that's not anybody's opinion. That is a demonstrated fact by the best empirical evidence. One of my favorite presidents is John Adams, and he famously wrote, "Facts are stubborn things." And in What Really Matters, as you know, I have over 400 footnotes, because I wanted readers to understand that even though as Christians we have a very strong, defensible, beautiful tradition of marriage, family, parenting. But what I wanted to do and What Really Matters is I wanted to write a book for everybody. And as you know, Kerby, one of the most important and distinguished living conservative intellectuals is Thomas Sowell. And Tom is a very good friend in his mid-90s, still doing remarkable work out at the Hoover Institution at Stanford University, a conservative of the front ranks. And Tom wrote something that I think, Kerby, beautifully summarizes what you just said. And I quote him at length in What Really Matters. Tom wrote that despite attempts to equate married couples with people who are living together as domestic partners, married couples are in fact better off than unmarried couples by almost any standard you can think of. And when I read this statement from Tom Sowell, and especially when he uses that phrase, in fact, I went back and I looked at every possible study or empirical set of data that I could find on the impact of each individual in that relationship, marriage, of course, being the foundation, but especially, too, on their children. And it is indisputably the case that people who are married and have children and raise their biological children together, by any objective measure, yes, both husband and wife do better, the children do better, and it's a remarkable gift.
Going to take a break, and when we come back, we are going to continue our conversation today talking about this book, What Really Matters, Restoring a Legacy of Faith, Freedom, and Family. We'll be back right after this.
This is Viewpoints with Kerby Anderson.
How many Americans attend church on a regular basis? The typical percentage usually cited is 22%. In other words, 1 in 5 people are sitting in a pew every Sunday. We have known that percentage is wrong. Decades ago, Gallup took the time to add up church attendance in towns and compared that to the population of the town. They knew the percentage was inflated. Kerry Newhoff has been looking at church trends for years and has been on my radio program. He has a new video out that documents what we already know. Researchers at the University of Chicago were able to get access to cell phone location data for 2 million Americans. They tracked the GPS pings for nearly a year and mapped every visit to a church. They concluded that the 22% is vastly inflated. The more accurate percentage is around 5%. As Kerry says, that's not a rounding error. People aren't telling us the truth. What's going on? Well, that's what researchers call a social desirability bias. We tell the pollsters, and even ourselves, that we're doing desirable things. We tend to overestimate the number of times we go to the gym. We underestimate the number of times we go to a liquor store. It is true that a much higher percentage of people go to church on Easter and Christmas. That's an event, not a rhythm. And we've also found that fewer people attend church if it rains, meaning that many Americans are fair-weather Christians. I raise this issue for two reasons. First, we've been using inflated percentages of church attendance and Christian influence. Second, it is a reminder that we need to work much harder to get people into church. I'm Kerby Anderson, and that's my point of view.
Go deeper on topics like you just heard by visiting pointofview.net. That's pointofview.net. You're listening to Point of View, your listener-supported source for truth.
Back once again as we talk about the book, What Really Matters. Book's just come out. You might be able to find it in your local bookstore, but as you might imagine, we have information about Dr. Tim Goeglein as well as the book on our website at pointofview.net. First chapter, of course, deals with restoring marriage, but I thought we'd also focus on Chapter 2, Restoring the Family. And in particular, Tim, this is very appropriate because next hour we're going to be talking with an individual that talks about the value of the family dinner, the fact that if you want to revitalize a church, sometimes that happens around the dinner table. And you, of course, have a piece that you wrote about the family dinner making a comeback. Also quote somebody that I quote with some frequency, Robert Putnam, and bowling alone and the whole issue of loneliness. So again, if we're concerned about the future of our country, maybe we need to figure out what we do in our own homes, don't you think?
Absolutely. And I'd like to pick up on both those points, if I may, because in the chapter on restoring the family, I share the rather sobering statistic that only 18% of American homes now consist of two parents with children. And Kerby, that is the lowest percentage ever. And in fact, we have the lowest ratio in recorded American history of marriage. We have the lowest fertility rates, in American history. It's interesting to me that fewer than half of U.S. households now consist of married couples. And by the way, this is a huge shift just from 50 years ago. In fact, if we were having this wonderful conversation, Kerby, just 50 years ago, nearly two-thirds of American homes were comprised of married men and women. Now, I'll tell you that that's sobering, but I'd like to share, and I'm an inveterate optimist, as I said earlier, I'd like to share a remarkable silver lining, which is that when the demographic of American men, 18 to 25, are asked, they say they want to return to religion and faith. They say they want to be married. They say they want to have children. And aspirationally, women in the same demographic say the same thing. The challenge is the following. Are those men marriageable? We have millions of young men not in school, not seeking to be in school, not working, not seeking a job. So the idea of marriage, family, parenting intimately tied to the idea of the American male and the restoration of the American male. It really all goes together.
And that's the third chapter, which I want to get to in just a minute. But my commentary today is about dismal demographic. And Molly Englehart wrote about the year America stops replacing itself. And you've been following this for some time. If we want to restore the family, first of all, we need to create families. And if we've looked at the fertility rate, it's been dropping for some time. And abortion is one part of it, but also lifestyle choices and all sorts of other things, Tim, are other reasons why we've seen this declining fertility, isn't it?
Yeah, absolutely right and well said. There is a very recent study which our listeners should know about. And this study found that about 40% of Gen Z and millennial men and about 52% of Gen Z and millennial women, they say that they, in many ways, perceive marriage as an outdated institution.
Mm-hmm.
And yet, despite that fact, according to a Barna survey, about 80% of the Gen Z and about 75% of millennials say that they hope to get married in the future. So there's this chasm between what they have, been, frankly, acculturated, and if I don't mind saying it, spun into believing about an outdated institution. Despite those cultural headwinds, young people still aspirationally see marriage, family, and parenting as a really good thing. So our challenge in the 21st century, and the church has a huge role to play, much larger than government. Our challenge, Kerby, is to close that chasm and to go tell a new generation that marriage, family, parenting, and babies is a wonderful way to live your life.
Well, again, we did talk about the need to restore the American male, and that's your third chapter. And I think you point out some issues. That is, for a long time, they've been talking about women not having the opportunities, but more women graduate from high school than men, more women graduate from college than men, more women are in graduate school than men. So you talk about the campus male for sure, but I think there's another key to that, and it gets back to the men's movement and all the things we've talked about before. If you want to have good sons, you have to have present and engaged fathers, right?
Mm-hmm. Absolutely. And I'd like to share just one remarkable statistic that I think, Kerby, 100% sums up the great point you just made. I was born in the last year of the baby boom, 1964. I'm 62 years old. In that same year, Daniel Patrick Moynihan published a very famous study. And he found a mere 62 years ago that 25% of all Black Americans were born out of wedlock. That number today is above 70%. 53% of Hispanic Americans are born out of wedlock, and about 33% of native-born white Americans are now born out of wedlock. The majority of babies born to American women, ages 30 years of age and under, are now born without a married father. So the fatherlessness crisis is what really matters. The fatherlessness crisis has had a huge impact on the rising generation of young American men.
Wow. One other point, and maybe into technology for just a minute, because a number of the articles that you have written over the years and a number of the pieces in these first three chapters get us back to the fact that if you want to be engaged, you got to get the parents off the phone. If you want kids to really begin to thrive, we need to get them off the phone. And it does seem to me that the tech challenge may be one of the most significant. And I know at Focus on the Family, you are talking about that, but it seems to me to be that's something that pastors need to address as well, don't you think?
I'm so pleased that you raised this because I don't mind saying that the single most important book on this topic, and one from which I have learned over and over again, is Jonathan Haidt's book, H-A-I-D-T, called The Anxious Generation. Jonathan is a social psychologist. He's the author of The Anxious Generation, and he has so powerfully documented the exact implication of this digital age that we are living in. And among many other very, very difficult impacts on our young people is the idea of the kind of digital dislocation, the loneliness crisis, the dating recession that is such a voluminous part of the rising generation in America. And it seems to me that we have to do something more than absorb and learn from this. And this is why I wrote What Really Matters, because as you know, it's not just a book about here's where we're at. A big part of this book is what can we do about it? That's the power of What Really Matters. It's a tool in our toolbox to share with our fellow Americans that, in fact, hope is ahead and there is a way to address these massive problems.
Let's take a break. I might just mention that we've had Jonathan Haidt on, actually to talk about the coddling of the American mind. But, of course, we'd love to get him on, if that ever is possible, to talk about the anxious generation, which we quote quite often here on Point of View. But we do need to take a break. And when we come back, we're going to talk about the idea of an ordered society, as well as the importance of history. And just as a promotional piece, we have not even mailed it out yet, but this new booklet I've just created here on why empires fall is certainly one attempt to help us understand how significant history is. And of course, during this 250th anniversary, of course, we have the booklet I'm holding up right now on a biblical view on the Declaration and a biblical view on America's founding. If we want to understand more about our society and even the importance of history, something which I've seen Tim write about so often, you certainly can find some of that material in what we make available to those of you that are donors. If you're interested in this book, and I would say it is quite readable, and as he pointed out, I think we end up with 460 different endnotes, so if you find yourself saying, well, I want to read that for myself, it's part of this book. Tim Goeglein and Craig Osteen are the authors of the book. It is entitled What Really Matters, Restoring a Legacy of Faith, Freedom, and Family. Fits, of course, to the kinds of conversation we've had. We've talked about marriage, we've talked about family, we've talked about men. I want to talk a little bit about an ordered society, a little bit about history, and certainly we are privileged to have with him today. And if you'd like to know more, go to our website, pointofview.net. We'll be right back.
Many years ago, they began saying that we live in the information age. Well, today there is so much information coming at us from every direction. The hardest thing is to discern which issues are really important and how can I make a positive impact without wasting my time trying to figure out accurate information. Let me give you a suggestion to help with that. Visit pointofview.net. Look at the tabs across the top. Find the one named Viewpoints. Kerby Anderson and others on our team are constantly watching for news to identify those issues that you really need to know about. They boil things down in a brief summary, and then you can decide if it's something on which you want to learn more and get involved. Again, when you go to pointofview.net, click on Viewpoints, you'll see exactly what I mean. You'll see the issues that we are covering right now. And when you like what you see, I honestly think you will, you can slide on over, enter your email, and get them automatically sent to your inbox each day. That's it. Take a minute now, be informed. Pointofview.net, click on Viewpoints. Point of View will continue after this. You are listening to Point of View. The opinions expressed on Point of View do not necessarily reflect the views of the management or staff of this station. And now, here again is Kerby Anderson.
Back for a few more minutes with, again, Dr. Timothy Goeglein, who, again, is the co-author, actually the author with Craig Osteen of the book, What Really Matters, Restoring a Legacy of Faith, Freedom, and Family. In the section on the importance of an ordered society, you talk about Gen Z, and I thought I might just point out that for some time, we really felt the need to reach out to the younger generation. We used to have a millennial roundtable. Now we call it the Next Generation Roundtable. Just had one Tuesday. And also, I'm holding up our little booklet on a biblical point of view on Next Gen with some of those surveys. But you do raise some very important questions, because without a compass to guide them, Gen Z wanders in the wilderness, as well as things like what Gen Z believes. For Gen Z, 1 is the loneliest number. Gen Z is trapped in the virtual cage. It is a topic you have come back to time and time again, because as we look at this youngest generation now coming of age, they are affected by some of the things we've already talked about: the fatherlessness of America, the divorce rate, cell phones, tech, all sorts of other issues. And there is really a need for individuals, whether it's at Focus on the Family or Point of View, or at churches or Christian ministries, to really reach out effectively to Gen Z.
You are absolutely right, Kerby, and so well said. Men account, and this is really dramatic. American men now account for 3 out of every 4 suicides or drug overdoses, and approximately 15% say they have no friends. And by the way, overwhelmingly, these numbers I've just shared are within Gen Z, Gen X, as you say, the millennials. I mean, it's a very large number in an otherwise complex continental nation, of 340 million souls. I was speaking just 2 weeks ago at a very prestigious private New England liberal arts school. Everybody on this, listening to us would know this college. And I was speaking to a very large group of young people, and I said, "How many of you?" And I asked just generally, "How many of you would say, even today, in all candor, do not have at least one close friend?" And my friend, a forest of hands went up.
Yes.
Yes. And I know that the plural of anecdote, as I said earlier, is not data. But when you realize that 50% of conservatives and 40% of progressives share in common a deep anxiety about the state of American men, you know that even in our polarized country, people, at least on most days of the week, are sensing or shimmering the same kind of thing. I was smitten, however, with a Pew Research study, Kerby, that found that 70% of adults believe it is very important for a man to financially support his family if he's to be a good husband. And I looked at those numbers very closely and realized that progressive men and women and conservative men and women, again, for all the chasm and polarization in our beloved country, they still come to the conclusion that men have a particular role, that the rising generation, I think, has to once again be the recipient of what George Orwell said. I mean, I love his observation that the first duty of an intelligent person is to restate the obvious. And I think we have arrived at that moment in 21st century America, Kerby, where we have to go restate the obvious. It's more important now than ever.
Restate the obvious, because common sense isn't so common anymore, and so we need some of that
Absolutely.
as well. Well, on your chapter on restoring faith, I could pick, of course, we've just been talking about loneliness, but there's a very good question you ask at one point. Does the church follow the culture, or does the culture follow the church? And I know, Tim, we have quite a number of people listening who are in church leadership. They may be a deacon, an elder, a pastor. They may be a Sunday school teacher. They may be a small group leader. And it does seem to me, and you've seen everything from George Barna statistics to some of the things that you've done there at the Focus on the Family research and all of that, to realize that we should actually be a thermostat, not a thermometer. And yet, in some respects, we're not actually determining the heat of the culture or the temperature of the culture. The culture is determining us. And it seems to me that we need to turn that around.
It's so remarkable that you would mention this, because just 2 months before the last presidential election, I was speaking in behalf of Focus on the Family to about 500 pastors. And the very first question after my remarks was something like the following. Mr. Goeglein, I think this pastor said, he said, I think I speak for most of us when I say that we really do everything we can not to pay attention to the federal government. And I said, the federal government, you may have a sense that you're uninterested, in the federal government. But I said, you all need to be aware as pastors and church leaders that the federal government cares a lot and is paying a lot of attention to you. And I think that we have got to wake up the church, and we have got to tell the church that you need to engage in the public square more than ever. That God created the church, He created government, He created family, and all of these great institutions are not to be confused with the other. But that does not mean in any manner that we need to build a high wall between the influence of the church and the ability to address the moral and social and, frankly, spiritual issues that most bedevil our country in its 250th year.
Wow. Well said. Well, again, just to keep it moving, chapter 6 was an encouragement to me, and you've been an encouragement to us, because I've really felt that Christians do need to address the issue of history, and it is always encouraging to have somebody that even knows who Howard Zinn is, as much of an influence as he's had, or the 1619 Project, or just the fact that we have a whole generation of young people that sometimes can't put the Civil War even in the right century, much less the right half century, don't even know what precipitated World War II. And if we can't figure out our history, we are destined to repeat it. And it does seem to me that one of the things that I've always appreciated about your writing is that you are a student of history, and you've been calling us back to learn our history.
Well, I'm very honored by that. And I'll tell you, in the 250th year of our nation, and as you know, Kerby, the cover of What Really Matters is red, white, and blue.
Yep.
And it's because of the year we're in and about this wonderful conversation we're having. I think if people forget everything we've said in this dialogue, and I pray they won't, but if they do, they need to be sobered by the fact that the average U.S. History score at the 8th grade level in America, this is overall in our beloved country, decreased by 5 points just between 2018 and 2022, and by 9 points compared to 2014. And what I did, Kerby, is I disaggregated those numbers. And here's what I found. Only 13% of American 8th graders are deemed proficient in the most basic American history. Wow. And I thought to myself, we need to absorb this, because our founding fathers and mothers knew that if you want to preserve liberty and freedom over time, you've got to nourish and create moral excellence, virtue in the people and in the leaders and in the citizens. Democracy is not a spectator sport. And the beautiful thing is that our friends at Hillsdale College have created what I consider to be the best single resource on the teaching of American history. It's called the 1776 Project, spearheaded by Hillsdale, and it is a remarkable K through 12 program. It's a curriculum that can be used in homeschools, charter schools, school choice, government schools, of course, Christian schools. It is a remarkable note to these really grim statistics.
And again, we've had Matthew Spalding on even yesterday when we were talking about the making of the American mind. Of course, he is at Hillsdale. But first of all, let me, just before I let you go, mention that we have a link to Focus on the Family, and that link is there. So if you are not already on their mailing list, you should be. Number 2, if you scroll down, you will see the book, and I suspect you might be able to find it in your local bookstore, but if not, we've made it very easy for you to get that. What Really Matters, Restoring a Legacy of Faith, Freedom, and Family. I'll hold it up so you can see that it does have the Star-Spangled Banner look to it. And Tim, it has always been appreciative of us around the table of the kind of writing that you do, and we appreciate the fact that you gave us some time today to talk about your new book.
An absolute joy, an absolute honor to be a part of this great program, Kerby, and you have my everlasting thanks and blessings.
Going to take a break, and we'll come back and get into some very important issues in the news. I hope that you will stay tuned. We have a lot more to cover. All that coming up right after this.
You're listening to Point of View, your listener-supported source for truth.
Back once again. Hope you appreciated the conversation with Timothy Goeglein. Again, he had to head on, but I'm glad that we were able to get 45 minutes with him as his book, What Really Matters, helps us understand faith, family, and freedom, something we talk about so often here on Point of View. And he has divided it into 6 chapters, as I pointed out before, just an enormous number of endnotes. So if you find yourself saying, well, I'd like to see the original study there, I'd like to get some of those facts and figures, statistics, this would be a great resource for you, and that's why we're thrilled that he could be with us today. And I did mention some of the booklets, because if we're really talking about the fact that we're in America 250, and we are, then of course I held up the booklet here. This was the one that came out just in April, and that is a biblical point of view on the Declaration. And if you are not an individual that is part of our truth team, you might want to get a copy of that. Of course, then the one that has come out more recently, which is the one, A Biblical Point of View on America's Founding. And those two sort of come together. But in some respects, even though this is a change of pace, the one that's coming out in June, I'm holding it up, we just received it. We haven't even mailed it yet, so you'll just be looking for it in your mailbox, is Biblical View of Why Empires Fall. And we talk about some of the different empires that have fallen, and then, of course, focus on, do we see some similarities here in the United States? And I would have to say that we do see some similarity, if for no other reason than we have not done a good job of educating the next generation. We are dedicated to providing that in a number of different contexts. Of course, we have the Know Why podcast. We have the Next Generation Roundtable. We, of course, have very soon releasing of an app that can be on your phone, so you can learn there. Of course, we have the Outlook magazine. I'm holding up the one that's already arrived in your inbox and in your mailbox if you have already been a donor, with the one on the war on Iran. And by the way, we are going to be talking about some of that next hour. And also, we'll be talking about tomorrow this whole issue of Supreme Court decisions on a variety of different issues. One having to do with the issue of racial gerrymandering, which was a 6-3 decision, but another one on a particular attempt to force pregnancy resource centers to reveal their donors. That one was won by Alliance Defending Freedom, and I think one of the amicus briefs came even from First Liberty Institute. They won that one 9-0. So we are certainly seeing tremendous success in a lot of Supreme Court decisions coming our direction, and we'll get into more of that tomorrow with Kelly Shackelford, and I think it'll be a great roundtable discussion. But let me just real quickly, since I did mention my commentary today, get into that just a little bit. And that is, it has the title, A Dismal Demographic. And it has to do with the fact that there was a very good article came out by Molly Englehart about the year America stops replacing itself. And we've been told for some time that sometime in the distant future, we're going to have a situation in which the deaths in the United States outnumber the births. And we have been heading in that direction for quite some time because we've seen a decline in fertility. And the argument was, well, maybe it would hit at 2040. Well, that's like, distant. Now they're saying maybe closer to 2030. And if you've looked on your calendar, we're already at 2026. So that's less than 4 years away. So, of course, we've been talking for some time about the declining birth rate in America. And some of that is simply just a reality that the future is going to hit a lot faster than we expected. And we can get a pretty good idea of what that looks like when we go to Europe and see how the fertility and declining fertility rates in Europe. Also, I might even mention some places in Asia like South Korea and others, and Japan, how that's affected it. And there are a couple of factors for why that's taking place. Number one, women are having children later if they're having children at all, and they're also having fewer children. And so as a result, the first part has to do with some environmental factors. Sometimes there's a rise in infertility for a variety of concerns, plastics, chemicals, industrial compounds, and all that. But a lot more of that is just the social cultural message that says, well, you might want to postpone having children and maybe not have children at all, because after all, they might be a burden. And we need to come back to a biblical point of view that sees children as arrows in our quiver, that children are a gift of God, children are a blessing, and yet nevertheless we have had this cultural message that if you're a woman, you need to postpone marriage. If you're married, you need to postpone having children, being a mother, and of course that is aided by contraception and abortion. What's so interesting is Molly Englehart points out the fact that even if abortion were counted back as births, which they're not, but okay, let's say they were, it would change the numbers significantly, but not completely. And that is, we would still not necessarily be at what we would call replacement level fertility. What she concludes is abortion is part of the conversation. Matter of fact, a significant part of the conversation, but it's not the whole of it. And again, we can recognize that a growing population signals energy and expansion. A declining population looks like decay and stagnation. So we, of course, bring children into the world with the hope that their lives will be better than even ours are. And yet there are more and more adults that are starting to wonder if that's really been the case. And part of that is when we look at some of the economic issues. And that brings us back to my commentary even yesterday, where we talked about this issue of government and inflation. Because the dollar has been devalued, you do have a number of young people, Generation Y, millennials, Generation Z, which we talked about today with Tim Goeglein, that are saying, I'm not sure I'm going to do as well as my parents did. And it seems to me that there are some very important structural changes that can and need to be changed if indeed that is going to be significant. But I think it also illustrates again that in the church, we really do need to put out the cultural message and the biblical message that children are a gift from the Lord, and that we should encourage families to actually have children. And I recognize that sometimes there's a hesitancy on the part of pastors to talk about encouraging families and encouraging people to have children when they recognize that some couples may have a problem with infertility. But they, I think, would also say we would want to have those children, even if all we could do is be an aunt or an uncle to that child, or we could adopt a child. And so it does seem to me that if we're going to deal with some of the issues in society, it comes back to the church and it comes back to the family. And that's why we're going to spend some time in the next hour for a while talking with J.P. Gance about what he has been doing in order to see what the church can do to begin to be more effective. But a lot of it goes back to what happens around the family dinner table. So I think you're going to appreciate his commentary. And then we'll get into this, because one of the articles I've posted is how the war really has destroyed the Iranian economy, and why that is, I think, a prayer target, if nothing else, for especially many of the Christians in Iran, but also for a need for some kind of resolution in that conflict, because though we want to remove the regime, we don't want to destroy the Iranian people, and certainly that is something we will talk about, and a couple of other very important pieces that I've posted for you to read today. And of course, don't forget that tomorrow we're going to spend some time looking at a lot of religious liberty issues, a number of Supreme Court precedents that are all coming our direction. Exciting time to live, and we will come back and talk more about that and about what we can do in our own families and churches right after these important messages.
It was not that long ago that censorship appeared to be almost inevitable. Free speech was being attacked and strangled in many places. And some of us wondered if this was the end. But now, many feel a new sense of hope, a chance for a fresh dawn. Let me caution you, now is not the time to relax. It's a time to press forward, to use this fresh opportunity to proclaim and learn how to apply truth to current issues. By the fact you're here, listening right now, that tells me that you recognize the vital role Point of View plays as a voice of truth. For more than 50 years, we've informed and equipped people who have made a real difference. And when you give to Point of View today, you breathe life into what can be a new golden era for the truth. Please, take a moment right now and invest in truth. Visit pointofview.net or give it 1-800-347-5151. That's pointofview.net. Click in now or call 1-800-347-5151. Point of View will continue after this. Across America, live, this is Point of View. And now, Kerby Anderson.
As I mentioned the first hour, these two interviews kind of come together because we've had, of course, Dr. Tim Goeglein talking about his book, What Really Matters, Restoring a Legacy of Faith, Freedom, and Family. And we're now going to be talking about what the church can do to strengthen the family and, frankly, what family can do to strengthen churches. And I think you're going to appreciate this conversation. Then we're going to get back to what is happening there in Iran. I want to focus some time and attention on one of the articles we posted on what is happening to the Iranian economy, and we'll get into other issues. But we bring, first of all, to the microphone, J.P. Gance, who is the founder and president of Communio. And we have a link to the website, which we'll talk about in just a minute. Also, the co-author of the book Endgame, The Church's Strategic Move to Save Faith and Family in America. He's been working in this area to equip pastors with a lot of data and all sorts of informed strategies to begin to broaden engagement. Before even launching Communio, he actually had a 3-year experimental initiative in 3 states to really test whether or not we can even move the needle on marital health, family stability, church engagement. Saw, for example, things driving down the local divorce rate. And as a result, I think you're going to want to find out more about the Full Circle Relationship Ministry, as well as, of course, the national research on some of the drivers for the decline of Christianity in America. So, JP, thank you for joining us today here on Point of View.
Kerby, fun to be with you, and really fun to know that I'm coming right after Tim. What a great guy and a good 1-2 punch here.
Well, I figured he'd be a good warm-up act for you, so there we go.
There we go.
And I suspect most of our listeners are not familiar with your work, so might give a little bit of the history. I did try to give a little bit of your 3-year experiment, but I think just give us some background because I think people need to know how much work you've already done in this field.
Yeah, we started a pilot initiative trying to improve and shift family dynamics on a citywide level. We did it in Jacksonville, Florida over 3 years with my good friend Richard Albertson at Live the Life, and we were able to lower the divorce rate across Jacksonville, Duval County by 24% in 3 years, and we had some business guys skeptical that we really did that. We moved 58,912 people through 4-hour longer skills ministry. We used a data-informed approach, as you noted, using data to target folks who might be at risk for divorce. And we moved that number of folks through 93 churches, ministry through 93 churches, and the net was the divorce rate dropped 24%. Some business guys didn't believe that we shifted that. They paid for an independent evaluation of our work. And Dr. Brad Wilcox found that there was no explanation for the decline in the divorce other than our intervention. Brad out of the University of Virginia and the Institute for Family Studies. So that's our kind of origin story, and we decided we had to wanted to take those findings and scale them. It took us a few years to figure out how to scale it, but we realized it's through the local church. And so we've supported now more than 440 churches in 32 states. We work at the denominational level, regional church network level, and then right at the local church. And we're basically a campaign consultant to the local church, help you run and win campaigns on marriage and the family. The way we describe it is we help equip the church to share the gospel through the renewal of healthy relationships, marriage, and the family.
Let's get into that because, first of all, I wanted to use this as a way to introduce you to some of our listeners that may not be familiar. And that Full Circle Relationship Ministry has a number of parts, which involves outreach, discipleship, and the relational stability. So maybe you could take us through those steps because that's been so successful, and it's something that individuals that are looking at their church and saying, we're just really not growing either experientially, numerically. We're not even having an outreach in our communities. So what can they learn?
Yeah. The biggest thing is to first recognize that the relational brokenness that exists in our communities is probably the biggest explanation for the rise of religious non-affiliation and folks falling away from Christian faith. 80% of everybody sitting in the pews on Sunday morning under the age of 60 grew up in an intact married family. If we want to know why there are so few millennial and Gen Z in church relative to older generations, that's the biggest explanation is the average family of origin of young people is less likely to be in an intact married home. Okay, so then how to solve that is our Full Circle Relationship Ministry approach, which is a full church approach. The idea is it's for youth, young adult, the single, the dating, the engaged, the married, those thriving and those struggling. We just want to make it normal that everyone grows in health and holiness through their relationships. And it's animated by what we call the ministry engagement ladder. It's a 4-step approach for this to be a front porch ministry. It's not just for people in the church, it's a front porch. So that 4-step is invitation. Okay, we're a world-class marketing agency for the church as a nonprofit ministry, and then into an outreach event that's 90% fun, 10% enrichment, building into a community we call ongoing engagement, say a parents' night out or a cornhole tournament for singles, something of that nature, that has 30% of enrichment and relationship skills and maybe even gospel proclamation. And then at the growth journey level, you really that's the 8 to 12 hour skills ministry. At that level, we're curating the very best stuff that exists in the space, help a church figure out what's good for them from different publishers and ministries. Okay, so in that sense, we're both a marketing arm to the church and a white labeled ministry resource, and then a coach to the ministry team to help them build just a world-class ministry that can lead to more people getting married, more people staying married. And Kerby, over last year we had 82,617 people come for relationship ministry through our church partners, and about a third of those were from outside of the church.
So again, we're going to take a break, and when we come back, we'll get into a little bit more. Let me just mention as we go to the break, my commentary today is called Dismal Demographic, in which we're talking about the declining fertility because women are waiting later to get married, to have children, if having children at all. And so you can begin to see the connection between that. And of course, you mentioned just a minute ago, Brad Wilcox. Of course, we have had some quotes from Tim Goeglein's book about the fact that he's been doing research in that area on the National Marriage Relationship Project, as well as Mark Regnerus at University of Texas. Those are all individuals that you can find out more about by simply going to the website. So as we go to our break, you might want to go to the website and check this out. Let me also open up the phones because as we get into some of this, perhaps some of you have a question that you would like to ask of JP in terms of what that might look like in your own church. What are the first steps? Maybe sharing some of the struggles that you've been having in trying to build up your church in terms of reaching out to people in your community. So that's the topic on the table. If you'd like to join us, 1-800-351-1212. Let's take a break. We'll come back with more right after this.
This is Viewpoints with Kerby Anderson.
Molly Engelhardt writes about the year America stopped replacing itself. We're told that sometime in the future, perhaps around 2040, something profound would happen. Deaths in the U.S. would outnumber births. Unfortunately, the date will be much closer than we expected. According to the Congressional Budget Office, the dismal demographic will arrive around 2030. I've been talking about the declining birth rate for decades. The future is merely coming closer than some expected. We've seen what a drop in fertility looks like in Europe, and we're now seeing the impact in our country. The reasons for a declining birth rate can be summarized with two factors. Women are having children later, if at all, and they're having fewer children. The first part is due to environmental factors and social choices. Our bodies are exposed to plastics, chemicals, and industrial compounds which affect both male and female infertility. Women are also given the cultural message that they need to pursue a career and only think about family later. They can do so because of contraception and abortion. Molly Engelhardt reminds us that if every abortion were counted back in as birth, the numbers shift in a meaningful way. The United States would move closer to replacement-level fertility, but still likely fall short of it. She therefore concludes that abortion is part of the conversation, but it is not the whole of it. A growing population signals energy and expansion. A declining population looks like decay and stagnation. We bring children into the world with the hope that their world will be even better than ours. Many Americans no longer believe that. This is where churches can provide hope. Pastors and Christian leaders need to speak about this dismal demographic. I'm Kerby Anderson, and that's my point of view.
Go deeper on topics like you just heard by visiting pointofview.net. That's pointofview.net. You're listening to Point of View, your listener-supported source for truth.
Back once again, G.P. Gance with us as we talk about what you can find on the website. And I thought for just a minute we might talk about the different factors of your ministry, because you have obviously what's called a full circle relationship ministry. We're talking about singles, talking about people that are engaged or dating, talking about married couples. We're talking about couples in crisis, considering divorce. So in some respects, that is sort of a whole orb strategy, isn't it?
It is, Kerby. Our vision is really for the local church to lead a Christ-centered relationship revolution, right? The sexual revolution hit retail in the 1960s. A lot of the bad ideas that led to it have its origins in the worst parts of the Enlightenment in the 18th century, but it really hits the 1960s, and we've been shaken by it. The church has been rattled by it. I think in different ways. The family has become unglued. It's weakened faith practice. And so we're not going to get out of this with a plug-and-play solution, a 6-week kit. This is a full circle approach, because we got to help our young people and everybody, the old expression, womb to tomb, have an appropriately healthy relationship everywhere in between, right? And so we want the local church to be that place where folks see that they love differently. And because fundamentally, we believe, Kerby, that one generation of Christian marriage, well lived, will transform the world.
Well, it certainly will. And again, the legacy that it leaves is certainly very significant. One of the things that I did mention in passing, and we do have information about your book, Endgame, the church's strategic move to save faith and family in America. But a lot of that gets back to trying to figure out what are the root causes of decline in faith in America. And you've been able to identify many of those, haven't you?
Yeah, but I think the single best explanation is the decoupling of sex from marriage, marriage from parenting, parenting from partnering, which gave rise to non-marital households. Okay, that all starts rapidly occurring in 1960, and then about 25 years after that, you start to see the proportionate growth in religious non-affiliation. Okay, and I go into this in our nationwide study on faith and relationships. If that hypothesis is true, you'd expect it to show up in numbers and survey data of those in the pews on Sunday. And we're sitting on over 200,000 completed surveys of Sunday churchgoers. In our study, the nationwide study on faith and relationships, we realized 80%, 4 out of 5 people sitting in church on Sunday, under the age of 60, grew up in an intact married home. The wild thing, Kerby, is that the youngest people, right? So single men in church on Sunday, in the 18 to 29-year-old demographic, 81% of those in church grew up in an intact married family. And when you compare that to the boomers, okay, say a 59-year-old man in church on Sunday right now, who's married, 81% of his peer group grew up in an intact married family. The big difference is somebody born, back in 1965 has a very different likelihood of growing up in that family structure than someone who say was born in the year 2000. So what shifted one before the other is family shifted before faith started to decline. And it's critical that pastors understand that if we're serious about fighting, this apostasy that we see, the growth in religious non-affiliation, that we got to get really serious about and understanding that Christian marriage is at the heart of it.
Well, I think so. And a lot of it gets back to, like you said, relationships. Earlier when we were talking with Tim Goeglein, we were talking about the Next Generation booklet that we have. We have a Next Generation roundtable, and a lot of that gets back to family relationships and the rest, and also a decline of orthodoxy. All of that is certainly very interconnected. We even have a booklet on sex and culture. So it does seem to me that if you're trying to find one answer, that is certainly one of those, but it's a collection of those that all come together and create the situation we find today. Because earlier this week, I had a commentary that came out just about the number of people in church and arguing that maybe, in fact, some of the numbers that are used for church attendance are way inflated, grossly inflated, whatever you want to say. And so it seems to me that we need to come back to what we can do as a group. So for a few minutes, talk about how people can connect up with you. We have a link to the website. There's a place where it talks about churches, why partner. You've got certainly some stories of impact, all sorts of research. You have a pastor's guide, blogs. So if somebody says, okay, I'd like to know a little bit more about this, I think our church could benefit, what's the next step?
Yeah, I would schedule a meeting with one of our church consulting team, a church coaching team. You can do so engage right through the website. Communio.org is the site. You can certainly also email our team, questions at Communio.org. I would encourage any listener to just sign up for our free e-newsletter, and you start to get some resources right away that can be helpful to you in your church. I'd encourage you, if you're not a pastor, to grab one of our free resources like our pastor's guide or a nationwide study on faith and relationships, and share it with your pastor directly. And there's some good takeaways, and encourage your pastor to reach out to us and schedule a free consultation and conversation. We work with a lot of family policy councils. We have great close relationships with folks at, say, the Center for Christian Virtue in Ohio, and out in Pennsylvania with the Pennsylvania family, and in Iowa with the family leader, and at the denominational level, say with the Texas Baptist or the Arizona mission network with the Southern Baptist Convention. So we work both at the individual church level, and we work very frequently through the regional church to grow the number of churches that we're supporting.
Let me just mention again that we have a link to communio.org. Go to the section that he was just mentioning, Research and Insights. Click on the one that says, for example, Nationwide Study on Faith and Relationships. And there you can actually get a full study if you would want to do so. Or scroll down to the second one, which he mentioned, and that would be, again, the Pastor's Guide, Supporting Parents and Sharing the Gospel with Their Children. There's where you can kind of explore the guide. And so whether you're a pastor or just a member of a church and saying, we really need something to maybe get us moving in the right direction, there's some resources there. Of course, there's a button that says why partner in the first place and gives you some of those facts. And as you pointed out just a minute ago, if you simply go to the website itself and scroll down, you're going to see a place where you can actually schedule an opportunity to meet with individuals. You can get a download, but also find out a little bit more about taking that first step. And so in some respects, those are resources for people to take advantage of. And again, if people find themselves saying, well, yeah, but you're on one end of the country because of Zoom and all sorts of other things, even though you won't necessarily be in the local community, you can communicate with those pretty easily, can't you?
Yeah, we work with churches and support them everywhere in every shape and size. You have to be a Trinitarian church that holds to the biblical view of what marriage is. And so we've worked with churches in the Northern Plains tribes in rural parts of Montana, down to churches in grinding poverty outside of in the sugarcane fields of Florida, to churches in suburban and affluent areas, and tougher downtown and more urban areas. So when churches get started, there's a great way for churches now to work with us through a Zoom and software-only supported coaching interface. But then you can also get our full-service approach, where we'll fly our team out to meet with your team to get started, and then we do video coaching and support of the church for the months and years after that.
Well, JP, I appreciate what you're doing, and I wanted people to first know a little bit more about you. So again, we have a link to the website. You can find out more what churches can do. You can hear some of the stories of impact. There's the nationwide survey, the Pastor's Guide. There is the blog. There's places you can sign up and find out a little bit more. And so all sorts of resources available at our website, pointofview.net. And JP, thank you for being with us today here on Point of View.
Hey, Kerby, thank you so much, and thanks for not cursing in the darkness. We can get after it and light a torch.
We will see what we can do to light some lamps. And so take advantage of what's happening there at Communio. And we're going to take a break, come back, and we're going to spend a little bit of time just really in a sobering way looking at what has been happening in Iran, and then a few other comments just before we wind down the program today. If you find yourself saying, well, I'd like to know more about the book by Tim Goeglein, well, that's available at our website. If you'd like to find some of the articles I'm going to be quoting from, that's there as well. If you'd like to know more about JP Gance and what they're doing right now in helping churches, that's available. So full service if you just simply go to the website, pointofview.net. Let's take a break. Half an hour left of some very important issues to talk about. We'll do that right after this.
Have you ever met a child you knew would do great things? They displayed remarkable imagination, understanding, and a zest for learning. Now imagine someone takes that child and instead of fostering their potential with a real education, they feed them nothing but lies. You know, that scenario isn't so far from reality. From a young age, Americans are fed a consistent stream of distorted facts, from the secular indoctrination they receive in many public schools, to the biases presented as fact in many colleges and universities, to the barrage of misinformation from the mainstream media and the lack of moral grounding in our society. It's not that Americans aren't capable of understanding the truth, it's that they aren't exposed to it enough. You can expose more Americans to the truth when you give to Point of View, where listeners receive facts, perspective, and biblical truth they don't get from society. As long as we have truth, we have hope. Give today at pointofview.net or call 1-800-347-5151. pointofview.net and 1-800-347-5151. Point of View will continue after this. You are listening to Point of View. The opinions expressed on Point of View do not necessarily reflect the views of the management or staff of this station. And now, here again is Kerby Anderson.
Back once again, let's, if we can, talk about Iran for just a few minutes. A lot of conversation about the military, but if you've been paying attention to the news, you know that the Treasury Secretary, Scott Bessent, has talked about Operation Economic Fury. And that is a little bit different because as much as the military has devastated the country, and I'm fearful for what the recovery might look like if we ever can provide an opportunity for recovery to the people of Iran, many of whom do not intend us harm. Nevertheless, the economic devastation may be more significant, hence the reason that I have posted this particular article by Jim Garrity, because he's talking about the fact that the war has destroyed the Iranian economy. Operations Economic Fury, if you're not familiar, taking various assets and seizing them. That's something that we've done when, of course, Russia invaded Ukraine, so it's not the first time, but about $500 million, $500 million of Iranian cryptocurrency, for example. There have been additional sanctions. Of course, there has been the naval and port blockade and even the currency destabilization. And it's interesting, Jim Garrity said back in March that in another publication, the Iranian mullahs weren't exactly known as economic savants before the shooting started. Even if they retain power after the war, they're going to be broke. And that is, rebuilding their military will be expensive, and the handouts for Hamas and Hezbollah, the building of a nuclear weapons program, going to be possibly unaffordable luxuries, even if people say that we've failed, and I don't believe that we have, but you can hear those comments being made every single day. And so he, of course, had a headline for his column, "When the Iran war ends, the mullahs will be broke." What's so interesting is he reminds us that he got all sorts of responses like, when the war ends, the United States is going to be broke. And things like, you haven't looked at our national debt or deficit. Of course, he has. He's written about this, and of course, so have I. But the point he was making is, if you think we have a problem, really, in Iran, a major problem, and really, I think, a source of concern and prayer for, especially the fact, as we've pointed out, there are so many Iranian Christians that we should be supporting as well. But the Wall Street Journal put it this way, because they did sort of a deep dive. They said government revenue has dried up just as the needs of the population are rising. The Wall Street Journal goes on to say the war has thrown around 1 million people in Iran out of work directly, another million out of work indirectly, according to some estimates that come down there as well. The cost of living has soared. The annual inflation rate is 67% in the month. Although if you look at it year to year, it's just off the charts. But we'll take that number, because just think about 67% inflation when we back in June of 2022 had 9% inflation. You can see the problem that is there. And so again, if we look at this, it has affected them in a number of different ways. Not the least of which is just even in tourism. Not that this is the greatest tourist destination, but nevertheless, a prolonged internet shutdown, which has been part of Iran, has now entered its third month, and that has cut off income for anybody doing any kind of commerce on the internet. Tourism has collapsed, with airlines, hotels, and local accommodations basically inactive. And as a result, the naval blockade has restricted oil exports and really even restricted any kind of trade at all. And so the question that really is looming large now is, when you keep pumping the oil from the ground and you aren't taking it out with oil tankers, what happens, because right now the estimates are that Iran has roughly about 12 days worth of storage left, and some of that has required them to even start using a derelict tanker as temporary storage. There is, of course, the possibility that they could shut down the oil pumps, and as much as some have said that they would never be able to restart them again, there's pretty good evidence, as I understand it. In this case, he's quoting from Columbia University Center for Global Energy Policy that say, well, you could restart those facilities. It would be just very time-consuming. And, of course, wells that have a high, what's called water cut, may not flow naturally after being shut down, but some can be restarted by pumping, injecting nitrogen and things of that nature. But this is a country that has been devastated by all the things that we've done, not just militarily, but what we've done economically. And I was reading the other day, see if I can find that, the relationship between the dollar and the Iranian rial is just sort of off the charts as well. So just imagine not having a currency that you can even begin to conduct any kind of negotiations, any kind of purchases. And I think this is a concern on the part of this administration. We don't want to bomb Karg Island or even any of the infrastructure, because the cost of rebuilding Iran is going to be huge. And you hope that there would be a possibility of doing so. So I did want to put that article out there for you to read if you would like, in terms of recognizing that in addition to the military devastation, there is also the economic devastation and turmoil there as well. But, of course, we had over the weekend another assassination attempt. So I wanted to post this piece by Byron York, because Byron York says that some of the troubling parts of this assassination attempt came from an individual that was referring Trump as a pedophile, a rapist, a traitor, a charge which is false, but nevertheless is just illustrative of the kinds of things you find on social media platforms and even here in broadcast media. He says, now it is important to remember that the vast majority of those who believe such things about Trump would never dream of getting a gun and going after the president. The problem is some would. And now many wonder what might be done to heal a troubled society so that attacks like Saturday's will no longer occur. And, of course, he goes into some of the other stories. You can, of course, remember Butler, Pennsylvania, July 13th, 2024. You remember the attempt on his life, September 15th of 2024, which was at a golf course in Florida. And, of course, then you have the Correspondents Association dinner, and you have to say, well, are there anything we can do? Well, it turns out that the White House Chief of Staff, Susie Wiles, has been convening a meeting of the Secret Service and the Department of Homeland Security to really assess what kind of security the president has. And one of the questions that certainly Byron York is raising is this. What would improve Trump's security? What might that involve? It likely would mean distancing the president from crowds, strengthening the security perimeter around him, and basically making it more difficult for Americans to get anywhere near the president. Now, he says that's not a palatable prospect. People want to see the president, big events, and Trump likes to be seen there. But look at two possibilities. One is having Trump skip big events, or if he attends, appears behind bulletproof glass, or be protected in some other way. This would be a disappointment for many people who want a good look at the president, but it also would be a way to protect the president. And he ends by reminding us that we had a terrible time in the past, in the space of 36 years. The killing of Abraham Lincoln, 1865, the killing of James Garfield in 1881, and then the killing of McKinley in 1901. Three presidents assassinated basically in 36 years. It would be like having 3 presidents assassinated since 1990. So back when we didn't have Secret Service providing the kind of protection they have today, we can see what happens. But in a country that is polarized, in rhetoric that is polarizing, and intentionally so, I recognize some say, no, I didn't mean it that way. Well, guard your words and watch what you say. But I think Byron York is starting to ask some questions that even if the president rejects them, are ideas that need to be put forward, because too many assassination attempts ultimately end up in being an assassination. And in that dismal 36-year period of Lincoln, Garfield, and McKinley, a reminder that it has happened before, and there is a reason for us to want to protect the president and the institution of the presidency, no matter what you think about the occupant in the Oval Office. Let's take a break. That brings us to a very interesting piece by Holman Jenkins about the interesting collaboration between left-wing extremists and right-wing extremists. We'll talk about that right after this.
You're listening to Point of View, your listener-supported source for truth.
Back for a few more minutes. Let me just mention that as we covered last week, the Southern Poverty Law Center, we found out, was actually shoveling money to various groups that they were supposedly speaking out against. Holman Jenkins talks about this as the way in which we can see that left-wing extremists have been subsidizing right-wing extremists, and the reason is because the audience is the media. And he talks about this in terms of, now we know that the Southern Poverty Law Center was actually shoveling money to right-wing extremists, at least an informant, to help organize the 2017 riots in Charlottesville, Virginia. And in some respects, now we can understand what was going on there. If you're not familiar, Charlottesville was where you had some of the neo-Nazi organizers, and then you had the counter-protester. And I was unaware of some of the background, although I know how that particular statement by the president about some fine people were completely misused by the media, intentionally so. And then a number of people over the years actually thought it was true and found out sometimes on live radio, Bill Maher's show, for example, where they said, no, that's not true. That is a media myth. And I've watched people go, really? I always thought that was true. But as Holman Jenkins points out, Charlottesville has long since come to betray all the cynicism of a pseudo event. Because it turns out that the neo-Nazi organizers knew that a similar legal demonstration weeks earlier had ended in a riot when a much larger group of left-wing counter-protesters descended on a very small city. And so as a result, the city of Charlottesville knew what was coming when it issued a permit for these right-wing extremists to actually march, because in some respects they knew what was going to happen because they had seen it happen in another city. And so its police department, he points out, deliberately decided to stand back and allow a publicly sanctioned event to be attacked by counter-demonstrators, inviting what then eventually would be kind of almost a state police reaction and an unlawful assembly. And interesting enough, an article that appeared days before by Peter Bynett was pointing out the fact that he said that left-wing and right-wing violent activists, in a sense, had become the unlikeliest allies in manufacturing these episodes. Why? Because they would get more media attention. So they were quite willing to know that there would probably be a confrontation, would certainly see that that would then generate all sorts of media attention, which both the left wing and the right wing craved. Of course, the sad reality is a woman was killed in that second Charlottesville riot. But in the midst of all of that, you might remember President Trump saying that there were very fine people on both sides, and then added, I'm not talking about the neo-Nazis or the white nationalists because they should be condemned totally. But the point he was making is there were some nicely mannered individuals who were very upset about taking down the statue of Robert E. Lee, and those were who he was talking about. But if you have followed this story at all, you know that the media certainly took about the very fine people clip and eliminated the part about not talking about the neo-Nazis and white nationalists because they should be condemned totally. And the press, and he says you could say either they were stupid or gullible or whatever, began to run with that. And so then we have lived with that argument for years that Donald Trump was calling neo-Nazis fine people, and it was something that was repeated ad nauseum by Joe Biden, occasionally by Barack Obama. It was repeated in all sorts of stories, and as a result, it just illustrates again how because the media was the group to whom they were playing the story, ran with it, and it was just really impossible to ever really deal with the facts there as well. And one of the things that Holman Jenkins says, if you ever wondered how the press could be so stupid, so gullible as to fall for the unsourced, implausible, made-up allegations of the Russia collusion hoax, well, the Charlottesville story, of course, is your answer. And he then takes us back to, of course, the fact is that on Saturday night, the assailant that wanted to assassinate him and many others offered, as he said, a sheaf of rationalizations of a predictable kind. They were the characterizations, traitor, rapist, pedophile, that major outlets indulge to on air and in their pages, and insisting their audiences that these are, even if they're unsupported by evidence, are good for ratings and good for clicks. And so the point he's making is that sometimes when these groups get together, even though they're on opposite sides of an issue, they sometimes work together anyway, or more than just the Southern Poverty Law Center paying money to right-wing extremists, even though they're supposedly fighting right-wing extremism. But sometimes these groups even work together in a sense, and I'm putting that in air quotes, so that they can get media attention, and the media quite willingly goes along with all of that, simply to say that this is what we will cover, even if we think that there is really no evidence of some of the things being said. It increases the number of people that click on a website, or in some cases increases the number of people that will tune in because it's good for the ratings. And so he says, next to the fine people hoax, only one thing has struck me as more cynical, to the point that I almost couldn't believe it, was I was watching in real time, and that was, again, what was, he says, Joe Biden's deliberate, premeditated helping of Mr. Trump on the path back to the White House, because, he argues, that the Biden campaign recognized that winning a re-election for Joe Biden would be difficult given the fact he was mentally compromised, but they were convinced that people would so hate Donald Trump that somehow Joe Biden would win re-election. It's just, again, showing how some of the cynical ideas that are part of politics and how some of the cynical ways in which the media covers these stories just illustrates why, as we've said on this program so many times, it is really helpful for you to exercise a very significant amount of discernment, and hopefully will be a way in which we can give you some facts and figures and information that you might not have if you were to listen to any other program. Certainly, we appreciate those who have, over the years, wanted to get truth out, and we certainly stand with them to try to do the same. A good example of that is Tim Goeglein's book, What Really Matters. 460 endnotes. If you say, as you read through it, well, I'm not so sure about that, check the endnotes. If you find yourself saying, I have a little bit of question about how the Southern Poverty Law Center was involved in actually helping promote right-wing extremism, well, here's an article on that. And, of course, we've posted a couple of others that help you understand a little bit more about what's going on in Iran and maybe even behind the scenes what might happen to try to protect the president from some of the assassination attempts that might be certainly in the offing in the future. That's all we have for today. As always, I want to thank Megan for help engineering the program. Steve, thank you for producing the program. Tomorrow is our Friday weekend edition. We're going to talk about a lot of very successful Supreme Court decisions that you will want to hear about, and we'll see you then right here on Point of View.
I'm sure that you've noticed that social media is now filled with information generated by AI. Dramatic descriptions of politicians and music stars supposedly making statements about a current issue, leaning into the microphone, looking into the lens, opponents silenced. It's powerful, it's riveting, and it's all lies. Even several national television networks were recently found using enhanced pictures, meaning manipulated, falsified, literally not giving a true picture. So many liars, so much deception. Where can we turn for truth? Right here. From Kerby and the team at Point of View, we need your support. Please join the Point of View Truth Team today with a monthly gift of $30 or more. Together, we can shine the light of truth and dispel the darkness and deception of this day. Give now at pointofview.net or call 1-800-347-5151, pointofview.net, and 800-347-5151. Point of View is produced by Point of View Ministries.